There's more ATACMS being launched at Russia. They are vowing that there's going to be a response to this. But then you have just story after story of Ukraine's utter deterioration, whether it's the desertions, the low morale, the fact that these ATACMS are about to dry up. Mark, how about you give us a rundown of what the state of this conflict is?
Okay, so let's start with where we are today first, because the Kiev regime / NATO just launched large long-range strikes on both Belgorod, which is already a long-suffering city in that regard. 8 U.S., the Biden administration fired 8 U.S. ATACMS ballistic missiles into the Russian city of Belgorod. And, the Western media will use these weasel words and terminology like allowed the Ukrainians to fire, when we know perfectly well that this is an American weapon targeted with American satellite data, with that targeting data programmed into the missile to be fired from an American military specialist on the ground, right? And we know that because no less a purser than the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, outright admitted that. He says, when justifying his reason not to send Taurus cruise missiles already a year ago, he commented that, the British to fire their Storm Shadows, the French to scalp the Americans, their missiles, they have to have people on the ground to do it, and I don't want to put people on the ground. And we've heard also the same from German generals who were plotting to blow up the Crimean bridge with Taurus cruise missiles in leaked audio. They also said, well, maybe we could get the Americans. They're already on the ground. They're firing, or the people with American accents is the euphemism they used to fire the German missiles as well. So this is a Biden administration ballistic missile attack, not the first one. I think we're on the 4th salvo. Now, the fact that all these missiles were brought down tells us, one, that Russian electronic warfare and air defense have developed a very effective profile and have proved very effective at bringing these missiles down, right? It's the same thing with all of these U.S. GPS satellite-guided weapons, right? Whether we're talking the ground-launched small-diameter bombs or JDAMs or the normal HIMARS rockets, all of these weapons that they've provided to Ukraine, right? We saw the headlines in the Western media, U.S. high-tech weapons work against Russia until they don't, right? It's the Borg sequence from Star Trek, right? You get 3 shots with your phaser, and by then the Borg shields have adapted, and that's it. And obviously, wherever Russia has electronic warfare and air defense assets, they're going to be bringing down at least 7 out of 10 of these things. Now, the what you can do is fire where there are no electronic warfare and air defense, but then it may not be as valuable a target either. I mean, Russia is a very big country to defend, but at 500, the ATACMS range isn't all that. We also have reports, just as I was sitting down, of large-scale attacks on Crimea and Sevastopol as well, with British Storm Shadows and drones. And that may very well be both aerial and naval drones again as well. So, the long-range strike war continues. Now, Russia, nearly every day, whether we're talking long-range drones like the Garan or its significant quiver of missile strikes, whether we're talking cruise missiles or ballistic missiles or hypersonic missiles, Ukraine is pummeled on a much larger scale, much more effectively, because the Kiev regime has little to no air defense, right, at this point, that can resist Russia's attacks in any significant way. And, they always claim, we've shot down 105 out of 100 missiles. The one that got through just happened to hit 37 different targets, this type of Baghdad Bob level propaganda that the Western mainstream media even seems embarrassed to regurgitate for us. So long range tracks continue. Significantly on the battlefield in the last week, Russia has essentially taken full control of Karakhov. The Russian Ministry of Defense hasn't announced this. This was an important supply center behind the Kiev regime's defensive lines in the southern Donbas region. Right. First, there was the breakthrough of the defensive at Avdiivka, right? Almost a year ago now, and then the Ocheretina Bloom, and then Russia has took Ugledar, the southernmost fortress city, Selidova, the southernmost of these supply centers. Now Karakhov, and really the only significant urban area and supply center left is Pokrovsk, and Pokrovsk is very quickly being taken into pinchers now, and those pinchers will slowly cut off its supply lines and allow Russia to move in from multiple sides. And Pokrovsk does not have very significant fortifications. So while it is a large urban area, I don't think that the defense of Pokrovsk will last as long as some people on the western side think it will. Turetsk and Chasiv Yar have been long, hard-fought battles, both of them, but both of them look like they're coming to an absolute end here in the next several weeks, month, two at the tops, and that's hanging on to a few outlying buildings in both cases at this point. Russian has over 90% of Turetsk, or the ruins of Turetsk, if you want to call it at that point. I think the significance of this, the Turetsk and the Karakhov being taken, is that for the first time since 2014, the city of Donetsk was able to enjoy a New Year's free of artillery strikes, right? The Kiev regime forces have now definitively, they already have been for some time as Russia was moving into Karakhov and the surrounding area. But now, other than HIMARS, right, there is literally nothing within the Kiev regime's inventory that can hit Donetsk city. So the people of Donetsk city, long suffering under the Kiev regime's artillery, pedal mines, and everything else on a nearly daily basis since early 2014 or middle of 2014. That is now finally out of the artillery range of Donetsk city, which is an accomplishment. So the South Donbas continues to be, a story of Russia steamrolling and the Kiev regime unable to put up any significant defense. And the last places where they were able to put up a defense, Turetsk, Chasiv Yar are falling. Russia is also moving in on Seversk and making very substantial progress in the direction of Kupiansk, Liman, and the Zhurabets River area. Lots of progress there in the last few days. I saw a Ukrainian military lamenting that in the last month or so, Russia was taking 20 square kilometers of Kiev regime held Ukrainian territory every day. And that's considering that Russia is still largely fighting a war of attrition, right? Capturing territory is still almost incidental. It's not what they're aiming for. And the other flashpoint is the still titanic battle. It's actually not as big as in terms of men deployed and everything, but in the Kursk salient, which is now pretty much reduced to a small pocket around the town of Suja. And Suja before the Kiev regime's incursion was a town of some 4,000 to 5,000 people, and that's the most significant urban area that they were able to take in this, backwoods area that they launched this attack in. And so the Kiev regime continues to throw reinforcements after reinforcements after reinforcements, not into Pokrovsk, not into Chasiv Yar or Toretsk, but into Kursk, into this death box in Suja. I have to assume that this is mostly for political reasons. I guess you could extend that into information warfare. But even with all the reinforcements they keep throwing in, Russia continues to advance. And the headlines have been grabbed in the last couple of weeks by the Western mainstream media, no longer really able to ignore the phenomenon of desertions within the Kiev regime's armed forces. Officially, the numbers are some 60,000. The Western media is talking 100,000. Ukrainian Kiev regime commentators are talking 200,000. And the real number is probably somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000. And some of this is gained by commanders not admitting when troops have abandoned their forces. Often they continue to collect the paychecks on behalf of those soldiers. And sometimes they even send them back to pick up 9-to-5 jobs. And then those people working 9-to-5 jobs send salaries, bribes basically back to the commander for not being at the front. But also, when they're referring to desertions, they've got two separate classifications of what amounts to, right? They use different acronyms, but AWOL, absent without leave, but is considered without the intention of permanently deserting. And then desertion, which is, leaving your positions without the intention to ever reserve. And of course, there's a huge amount of gray area between the two of them, and classifying a lot of people as AWOL rather than desertion helps bring the numbers down. So if you're wondering where this 1 million man army is on top of the deaths and the casualties, well, there's a huge number of desertions as well. But despite all of this, and despite the general trajectory on the battlefield, I think we need to have a serious look and understand that this isn't over yet. And all the indications is that the Kiev regime is about to launch another suicide offensive, or more than one. If you have been paying attention to their mobilization, despite the very large numbers of desertions they're suffering, and desertions even in NATO-trained Ukrainian forces. The 155th Mechanized has been reported in Bloomberg and other places in the last couple of days. And this was a force where a significant portion of it was being trained in France. And this is actually a problem because a lot of Ukrainian troops who are sent into European countries to be trained try to sneak out while they're there. They try to take advantage of the opportunity and desert while in NATO countries, which is one of the reasons why they're so eager to send troops to train Ukrainian troops in Ukrainian territory, because then they don't suffer desertion, and then end up with essentially refugees on their own territory. But the 155th Mechanized, by the time they were to be sent into, direct combat with their newly French-trained officer corps, they had suffered some 1,700 plus desertions, which is essentially half of their of a brigade, right, of their total fighting force. Despite all of this, they have conducted a large, what is euphemistically called mobilization campaign, right? Mass forced conscription with violent press gangs roaming the country. And if reports are to be believed, they've now stood up some 14 brigades. They have received very large amounts of Western equipment, ammunition, but also military equipment that we last saw something approaching that. I mean, it's not quite the same extent, but we last saw something like that in the spring of 2023 before the big offensive in Zaporozhye. The U.S. has sent more than 200 Stryker vehicles, armored vehicles, and they have not shown up in any significant numbers on the battlefield in the months since they've been sent. The Australians have sent something like 50 older Abrams tanks. We've also seen large numbers of armored vehicles from Germany and other countries. These have, as far as I can tell, have not appeared yet on the battlefield. So, in an attempt to make some last-minute information warfare gains before Trump takes office on January 20th, to create facts on the ground going into what they believe will be negotiations and a ceasefire. The Russians have no intentions in that regard at all, but that's seems to be what they're counting for. But also, I think, considering that morale is a problem, and this is a double-edged sword, and there may be arguments that, well, if we show that we're back on the offensive and fighting and taking territory, then people might be less willing to desert. On the other hand, there's a lot of people who have seen how well that worked out in Kursk. But there are very large buildups of Kiev regime forces in several areas. And there are 4 potential vectors for this Kiev regime offensive. And it may be more than one, although at the end, I believe most of the forces will be diverted to one, and the others will probably be mostly diversionary. But there's 4 main regions where we can expect this sometime between now and spring, right? Where the height of winter is most like when this will be launched. But one is a buildup in the Sumy region towards Bryansk. And if you are familiar with the northern Ukrainian border with Russia, right, in the very east, there's 3 Russian regions that border Ukraine up there, right? The Belgorod region, where we've seen numerous attacks. That's where the ATACMS attacks were just in the last 24 hours. Then you have the Kursk region, where the current incursion is finally being, ground down and driven out now with this pocket around Suja. But to the west of the Kursk region, the westmost of these 3 regions is the Bryansk region. And there has been a very large buildup of Kiev regime forces on the other side of the border. And Russia has launched very heavy ballistic missile attacks, Iskander strikes, as well as artilleries into that area in the past few days. And likewise, the Kiev regime has also been conducting large-scale artillery attacks across the border. This is classic, artillery prep on both sides before a encounter battle, right? Before we can expect to see Kiev regime forces trying to cross the border and temporarily taking more Russian territory. However suicidal it might be, and strategically, I think it makes even less sense than the Kursk incursion would. But that's a possibility to look for. Another one is across in the south, in the Zaporozhye region again, but in the direction of the Kakhovka Reservoir, or what used to be the Kakhovka Reservoir. Because if you'll remember, some time ago, almost 2 years now, the Kakhovka Reservoir Dam was destroyed, almost certainly by the Kiev regime. And now that ground is largely passable, and particularly in the height of winter, may be frozen and completely passable to even heavier weapons. And right across the Hovka Reservoir, or the former Kakhovka Reservoir, is, of course, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which the Kiev regime has launched multiple amphibious assaults on back when there was a reservoir, all of which dramatically failed, and that the Western media only admitted to like a half a year later. But they launched multiple such attacks across the reservoir, all in dramatic failure. But we may see a repeat of that again. And part of this is some type of, it is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, a very significant energy supply. It would help the Kiev regime with the electricity problems that they're having because of Russia's repeated missile strikes on the Kiev regime's electrical infrastructure. But also between Zelensky and particularly Budanov, the Kiev regime's military intelligence chief, seem to have a real, almost hard-on sexual obsession with the idea of taking a nuclear plant or some type of nuclear facility or armaments like tactical nuclear weapons, and possibly in the Kursk area, and using that as some type of blackmail or some type of false flag and catastrophic situation to try and once again drag NATO directly into the conflict. So that is probably the second most likely area. And once again, there is a buildup of Kiev regime forces there. There is a buildup of Russian forces. And there are artillery strikes and drone strikes to a greater intensity than we have seen previously happening there right now. The other two possible areas where a Kiev regime offensive might be launched is into Transnistria in Moldova. Moldova is a small country wedged in between Ukraine and Romania. It is a divided country, with the easternmost region, Transnistria, being a separatist region, of which there are small separatist region of which there have been roughly 1,200 Russian peacekeepers for, close to 2 decades. This all broke down as the Soviet Union was dissolving in the early 90s. So this has long presented a problem for Moldova. Moldova, once again, just recently re-elected a very pro-Western, pro-NATO president, Maya Sandu. Yeah, she got through by the skin of her teeth once again, but she will continue this agenda. She is fully bent on a Western course, and she, of course, wants to retake Transnistria. This has all been complicated by the Kiev regime's moves in the recent days to refuse to extend or renew gas transit contracts through Ukrainian territory, through the Druzhba Soviet-built pipeline into Europe. And all through this conflict, this has not been affected by Western sanctions because exemptions were created for it. The largest amounts of this gas goes to Slovakia, Hungary, but also Austria, Italy, and Moldova. And in Moldova, it goes through Transnistria. Now, with the refusal to renew those contracts on January 1st, Gazprom was forced to halt the transit of gas through Ukraine, which means they're no longer able to fulfill their contracts, although they're not legally responsible in this regard due to Ukraine stopping itself being a transit country. It has to keep in mind that Ukraine this entire time was drawing gas for its own purposes off of those pipelines, right. And it was collecting money for transit fees, significant money. Yeah. Right. So all of that is gone now. But perhaps the country most affected by this is Moldova. And Moldova has been entirely dependent on Russian gas for its energy supplies. Now, there has already been made emergency arrangements for, of course, far more expensive American LNG to be shipped up from Greece into Moldova. But of course, none of this gas is going to reach Transnistria, the separatist region. Why would they provide energy for that? So Transnistria is in an acute energy crisis right now. They're switching to emergency supply of coal, but right now they're not supplying electricity except to hospitals and other emergency venues. It's already a humanitarian crisis in the middle of winter. And the supply of coal will last maybe 52 days as of a couple days ago, I think, right? Russia cannot supply reinforcements militarily or logistically to Transnistria at this point, to its troops there, to its peacekeepers, or to the people there, because it's completely isolated from this and it's, landbound. Russia can't get supplies in there. They would have to take Kherson, across the Dnieper, take Kherson City, Nikolaev, and Odessa, which on their own would be probably more than a year's worth of military campaign and, risking amphibious crossings and the like. So this is a very bad situation. And there have long been rumors that the Kiev regime may cooperate with Moldova and basically wipe out the Russian peacekeepers there and retake Transnistria for the Moldovan government in Chisinau. This is all the more complicated because in Transnistria is one of the largest Soviet arms and ammunition depots, perhaps the largest one, where almost all of the weapons that were withdrawn, weapons and ammunition that were withdrawn by the Red Army from the Warsaw Pact were dropped off in Transnistria. Now, a lot of these weapons are old, the ammunition, they haven't been well maintained, but beggars can't be choosers. And the Kiev regime, these would be far more effective in the Kiev regime's hands than Western weapons, right? Because they know how to use these. They know how to maintain them. They know how to refurbish them. They know how to use it. This is why in late 2022 and 2023, the Kiev regime was quite effective in using all of the Soviet legacy equipment provided by all of the former Warsaw Pact countries who are now members of NATO, like Slovakia, like Poland, like Hungary did not participate, but many others, Czech and many others did there as well. Now one can presume that the Russian troops, the Russian peacekeepers there, almost certainly have this thing wired to blow if it ever looks like the Kiev regime could get their hands on it, because it could sustain their war effort for, 2 years, maybe more, if they were to get a hold of it. But you have to presume that they have contingency plans in place as well. So this is quite a pickle. It is an intersection of this desperate search for some type of offensive that will break the Kiev regime out of the kill box they're in, because the way it's going, of course, with the war of attrition, they're just being ground down and there's nothing they can do. They're looking for a way out. They're looking for some type of way of changing or some type of black swan, effectively. And this ends up with an intersection of energy geopolitics, right? Slovakia and Hungary are, of course, furious at the Kiev regime. Slovakia is threatening to cut off electricity. The Slovak Prime Minister, Robert Fico, no friend to the Kiev regime. He survived an assassination attempt by a pro-Kiev regime radical, an extremist. And the Kiev regime has survived these Russian attacks on its infrastructure, largely because of energy being sent by Europe into Ukraine, electricity. And Slovakia has been the biggest provider of this, right? Hungary to a lesser extent as well. So it really seems like the Kiev regime is very eager to, cut off its own foot to spite itself here. But this is an angry little geopolitical hornet's nest of energy and separatist tensions and NATO aspirations of Moldova as well, or the pro-Western factions within Moldova. Moldova is a very divided society, right? If you put Transnistria back in, it's split 50-50. If you take Transnistria out, which politically it is right now as a separatist region, then it's 55 pro-Western, 45 pro-Russian. You see how this is all rather complicated there. But there are other separatist regions in Moldova as well that or potential separatist regions. The things could go very south in Moldova. And of course, this would be a very big horizontal escalation and expansion of the war into another country, right? We've already seen this conflict to some degree extend into Africa and into Syria, right? With the Kiev regime supporting Al-Qaeda, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which recently overthrew the Syrian government, supporting Islamist rebels in the Sahel. But this would be a major escalation beyond that, right? And this would be another European country, and it would lead to renewed cries that Russia is trying to, bent on aggression and expansion and creating some former Soviet Union, when in reality this is all being provoked and escalated by the Kiev regime and NATO. So this is another potential vector for offensive to watch for in the next few months, and it's such a political energy, geopolitical hornet's nest. Everything's wrapped up there. The other the other potential is another attack in the Belgorod region. We've seen multiple of these Russian neo-Nazis that fight for the Kiev regime attacks there. The Russia Volunteer Corps and the Free Russia Legion, which are just, even the New York Times admits, outright flaming Satanist neo-Nazis, right? So we could see a renewed offensive there, perhaps by the Kiev regime military. And there's always the outside chance of another potential escalation and expansion by going for Belarus. Belarus is in the heat of a, quote, election campaign where the Belarusian president / dictator for life, depending on your reading of it, everyone's favorite curmudgeon, Alexander Lukashenko, who is affectionately known in this part of the world as Batka, which is like saying uncle.
Right.
So he is, quote unquote, running for president again, and you can be sure that there is the potential for another regime change effort, perhaps to be dovetailed into a cross-border excursion there. Despite the fact that Russia has recently officially thrown a nuclear umbrella and said that it's going to be supplying Lukashenko with Oreshniks as well and everything else, but they consider Belarus to be vulnerable, right? Perhaps in the same way that Syria was vulnerable, right? To not a direct military assault, but to some type of hybrid warfare. So lots of possible vectors. And I would suggest that you'll see something kicked off in more than one of those areas in the next few months. But then the majority of the effort will be funneled into one of them. Much like the way Russia arranges now for multiple possible vectors of attack, and then they make the final decision, largely depending on where the Kiev regime puts its own defensive units, where opportunity arises. Because, with satellite coverage, with the amount of intelligence on both sides, that's the way you have to achieve tactical and strategic surprise in situations like that. Is your force has to be like water, It has to be able to flow, and logistics are a big part of that. So you flow to where there's opportunity, to where the opponent hasn't enough defensive forces, and where units may desert or break away, or whatever situation evolves.